The dense forest swallowed up every trace of the world beyond, its trees towering like ancient sentinels with gnarled limbs that blocked out the sun. A strange stillness hung in the air, the usual sounds of birds and insects eerily absent. Yet, for 5 urban explorers, this quiet isolation was exactly what they sought: a thrill, a challenge, and the promise of a discovery no one else had dared to make. Rachel, the leader of the group, had always been drawn to the forgotten places, the abandoned asylums, derelict hospitals, and long-forgotten towns hidden deep in the wilderness. She'd heard whispers about a village that had vanished from maps, a place lost to time. No one spoke of it openly, and those who had lived nearby only referred to it in hushed tones. But Rachel's curiosity was too strong. She had to find it. "Let's head deeper," she said, her voice cutting through the thick forest as the group pushed forward. The sun had begun to dip low on the horizon, but they had to reach the village before nightfall. Mark, her closest friend, looked skeptical as he brushed the sweat from his forehead. "We've been hiking for hours. Are you sure this village even exists? It's supposed to be on the outskirts of this forest, not in the middle of it." Rachel smirked. "That's what makes it perfect. It's supposed to be forgotten, buried in the woods." Their group, Ben, Jamie, and Lily, nodded in agreement, but there was an unease in the air. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. Even their footsteps felt muffled, as though the forest itself was trying to swallow them whole. Then, they found it. The village was like a ghost from another time, standing completely still in the heart of the woods. Its buildings were wooden and worn, some half-collapsed, with moss-covered roofs and shattered windows. But what struck them most was the feeling of abandonment. There was no sign of life, no sounds of animals, no wind rustling through the trees. It was as though the world had simply erased this place from existence. Rachel approached the center of the village first, with the others trailing behind her. There was an eerie calm, and something about it felt wrong, like they were intruding on a space that should have been left undisturbed. "This place is strange," Ben muttered. "It's too quiet." They explored further, entering one of the decaying homes. Inside, it was as if the people had simply vanished midlife. Plates set on tables, half-burned candles and lanterns, a doll lying in the corner of a child's room. But there were no signs of struggle, no signs of violence, just absence. Rachel examined the fireplace, noticing the blackened walls and the strange symbols carved into the stones. They were unfamiliar, twisted designs, like something drawn from a fever dream. The room felt colder as she stepped closer, a chill that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "I don't like this," Lily whispered, glancing around nervously. "It feels wrong." Rachel turned to Mark, trying to suppress the growing anxiety in her chest. "Let's check the town square." They made their way to the village center, where a large stone well sat. The village was laid out in a circle around it, with narrow streets leading off in every direction. In the center of the square was a statue, an old, weathered figure obscured by time. The stone face was mostly eroded, but the eyes, wide and hollow, seemed to follow them. "This is a place of rituals," Jamie said quietly, scanning the surroundings. "I've read about these kinds of villages before. Isolated communities that practice things like old magic, strange rites." Rachel's stomach twisted. There had been rumors, stories from old books and newspapers about villages that vanished without a trace, but none of them had ever been fully explained. And now, standing here, in this place that was abandoned yet still felt somehow alive, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. "We need to find out what happened here," Rachel said, more to herself than anyone else. As the sun began to set, the light growing dim, they stumbled upon a small stone building tucked away at the far end of the village. It was different from the others. Its door was still intact, and strange markings covered the wood, some of which seemed fresh, as though recently carved. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as she reached for the door handle. But the moment her fingers brushed the wood, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of stale earth and rotting wood filled their noses. But it was the walls that drew their attention. They were covered in more of the same twisted symbols they had seen earlier, and beneath the symbols, dozens of dried, blackened handprints were smeared across the walls. "This is the source," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. A dark wooden altar sat in the center of the room, surrounded by flickering candles that appeared to have been recently lit. As they circled the altar, Rachel's eyes fell on a set of old, brittle books scattered across the floor. She bent down and opened one, scanning the yellowed pages filled with diagrams, rituals, and strange incantations. As she read, a sense of dread began to coil in her stomach. "The ritual, it's a summoning," she said, her voice trembling. They were trying to call something ancient. Suddenly, a low, distant sound echoed through the village, a soft, rhythmic drumming, almost like a heartbeat. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating in their bones. Lily gasped. "What the hell is that?" "Get out of the building," Rachel ordered, her heart pounding in her chest. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping them inside. The drumming grew louder, faster, and suddenly, the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, just out of reach, but there was something moving, something waiting. Then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. At first, it was just a shape, tall, hunched, and dark. But as it stepped into the dim light, the group froze in terror. It was human, or had once been. The skin was stretched tight over its bones, pale and mottled with patches of unnatural gray. Its face was hollow, its eyes wide and unblinking, but there was something deeply wrong about its expression. It grinned, a grotesque mockery of a smile that sent waves of nausea through Rachel's stomach. Then, more figures appeared, emerging from the darkness. One by one, they stepped into the light, their movements jerky, unnatural. They had no eyes, no hair, just smooth, pale skin stretched over their skulls. Their mouths were wide, too wide, twisted in horrific smiles, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Ben backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell are they?" "They're the villagers," Rachel whispered, choking on the words. "But they've changed. They're not human anymore." The figures closed in, their movements jerky and fluid at the same time. They circled the group, their empty eyes locked onto them with an intensity that made Rachel's skin crawl. And then, she understood. The ritual, the summoning. The villagers hadn't disappeared. They had been taken. Their bodies had been transformed, twisted into something else, something monstrous. And now, they were hunting the intruders, ready to claim new victims. Jamie screamed and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The figures advanced on them, their mouths stretched wide, and Rachel realized with horrifying clarity that they weren't just hunting for bodies. They were hunting for souls. The last thing Rachel saw before the darkness took her was the monstrous grin of the closest figure. She felt her limbs growing heavy, her vision narrowing, as though the world itself was folding in on her. She tried to scream, but no sound came. When the group's cries had faded into silence, the village returned to its stillness. The drumming ceased, and somewhere, deep within the woods, the village waited, patiently, for the next group of curious souls to stumble upon its cursed streets.